if we as people can better understand how the media, how our candidates, how our leaders turn us against each other, then I think we become less susceptible to actually turning against each other. If we can educate ourselves in understanding those polarizing tactics, if we can expose the debate, if we can expose the way in which our candidates operate, then I think we stand a better chance at making sure that while the leaders out there turn us against each other, we as individuals and citizens can actually work together to solve our problem. Hello, amazing people. Welcome back to the Hopeful Majority. Tomorrow is the vice presidential debate. I don't even know if you knew that. I didn't know that, frankly, until we started recording this episode. And the conversation today is going to be about the three things that you've got to know to understand how and why the candidates will talk the way they talk tomorrow. It's all about exposing the polarizing tendencies in our discourse, and you don't get that anywhere outside of the Hopeful Majority. Look, we put out an episode like this around the presidential debate. People really appreciated that. So we said, let's do round two. Let's expose the vice presidential debate for what it is, and importantly, to understand how our candidates are going to turn us against each other so that we can actually avoid that. And by the way, if you're a regular listener and you're like, what's going on with this background? I'm actually traveling somewhere in the middle of the road, but the hopeful majority does not stop. I'm going to see you on the other side of this. Let's get into the three things that you need to know to understand the vice presidential debate. Here's what we need to know about the vice presidential debate tomorrow night to better understand how our candidates actually operate, engage, talk so that we don't get divided. Now, you're like, what are you talking about? Especially if you're new to the show and you haven't heard the word outrage industrial complex. And if you're old to the show, you're like, I know exactly what you're talking about. Please stop talking about the outrage industrial complex. I'm outraged by the complex. Here's the deal. We live at a moment where we are highly susceptible to outrage. We're highly susceptible as people to our polarizing tactics by our candidates. And I think that if we as people can better understand how the media, how our candidates, how our leaders turn us against each other, then I think we become less susceptible to actually turning against each other. You following me, right? If we can educate ourselves in understanding those polarizing tactics, if we can expose the debate, if we can expose the way in which our candidates operate, then I think we stand a better chance at making sure that while the leaders out there turn us against each other, we as individuals and citizens can actually work together to solve our problems, to actually talk across lines of difference. And that's the goal of these special episodes as they relate to the debate. So, what are the three things that you've got to know about the vice presidential debate tomorrow night? Thing one, you see what I just did there? Thing one is that we live during a time of a culture of fear. Culture of fear is what pervades every part of society. And because we live during a culture of fear, what means is that we are uniquely susceptible to people turning us against each other because we are scared of the moment. We're scared of each other. There's a lot of skepticism. Fear breeds inherent questioning of everything around us. And when we are likely to question everything around us, when we're likely to fear our neighbor for the way that they vote, when we're likely to fear each other for the way we look, when we're likely to fear each other because of our ideological affiliations, whether we're Republican, Democrat, Independent, you name it. When we fear that, our candidates understand that that is a signal that they can exploit. As we know, politics ultimately is all about figuring out what are the wedges that keep people against each other, and then to just absolutely drill down on those wedges because they know that that fear is what's going to motivate you to show up to the polls. That's in some ways what differentiates, I think, hopeful candidates from cynical candidates, is because cynical candidates fundamentally believe that the way that they get you off that couch, the way they get me off the couch, is by making sure that I am absolutely scared of you, the person that's listening to this. We've got to understand that because we live in a culture of fear, the way in which the two candidates are going to show up tomorrow, JD Vance and Tim Walz, is they're going to show up to make sure that you are absolutely scared of your fellow American that believes in something different than you. And oh, let me actually change that. Not just scared, but they're fundamentally evil, potentially. Because if the person that votes differently than you is fundamentally evil, right, or fundamentally does not believe that you should exist, then suddenly what happens is that you are justified in not only hating them, but you are justified now in showing up to the polls as quickly as possible and putting your candidate in place. Here's the problem in all of that. You know who wins? Not us. It's the leaders. Those of us that profit on dividing people. Those of us that actually get votes because they can say that, you know, you hating the other person means that they don't have to actually solve any problems. And yes, tomorrow I think you're going to see some contrast. One candidate is probably going to approach their angle of fear in a different way than the other candidate. But what they're trying to understand and manipulate and do is they recognize that because we live in a culture of fear, they have to make sure that you understand that. And by us recognizing that we live in that culture of fear, we can actually unplug. We can actually understand that when the candidate on the TV screen says, he or she is voting for a completely open border, they're a threat to everything that you hold, you say, let me investigate that a little bit further. Or when the other candidate says, this person is going to take away your right to choose at every level, and that they absolutely do not recognize your freedom or sovereignty, you say, let me hold on and wait and check that out. Because if we can say, let me wait, hold on, and check that out, we can start to actually break the gears of polarization. Thing two, thing two is that we live at a time where the real debate is won not on the TV screen, but on the short clips that perceive right afterwards. Let me tell you something really funny. Last debate, my brother, who's in 10th grade, texts me about the things that he saw in that debate. And part of that reason is because he watched all these TikTok clips about the debate immediately afterwards. Our candidates recognize that low propensity voters, right? Young people like us, folks that normally don't show up to the polls, people that are at different demographics, different backgrounds, different ethnicity levels that primarily get their information from social media. They know that the real audience that they got to flip over there is they got to talk in short clip content. They have to be quick, 30-second hits. If you can understand that the real debate is not the 90-minute debate on TV, but what happens on short clip social media, then suddenly you realize that, oh, these candidates are not actually trying to get their views across in a coherent, nuanced way. What they're trying to do is they're trying to set up their social media teams on their campaigns to draw up the best 30-second clip they can take of this person taking on that person and put that online and make it go viral. The real debate is not one on TV, it's one on social media. When you realize that this is a 30-second clip debate, not a 90-minute nuanced conversation between two people that are trying to get to some truth. Oh, how good would that be, right? How good would that be? When you realize that, suddenly you start to understand that, okay, the way in which these guys are operating, the way in which they're going to show up is going to be to play to that 30-second content. And when we understand that, again, we become less susceptible to that 30-second content. As the outrage industrial complex theme has followed the show over the last 65, 67 episodes, as you saw last episode, we had on Deb Roy, who really gave us the inside scoop on Twitter and gave us the inside scoop on LinkedIn, and gave us the inside scoop on how we can make AI more effective. He told us, right, that when we realize that outrage is what sells, that's what the algorithms are going to favor. And so if you as the consumer are going to reward that short clip content, if you're going to avoid it, reward getting entertained by the candidates, if you're going to reward the outrageous clips, not the nuanced conversation about complex immigration policy, that's how the candidates are going to show up. You see this? It's like a virtuous cycle. You know, we go in circles, right? If the candidates know that they've got to play to nuance and hope, like what we wanted, the hopeful majority, that's what they're going to play to. If they're going to play to anger and hate because they know that that's what the consumers want, that's what the voters want, because it's easy, it's junk food, that's what they're going to play to. In some ways, politicians are like weather vanes. They're not necessarily leaders, they just follow the strongest, loudest voices. And once we start to see that, once we start to realize those dynamics, we become less susceptible to hating each other and we turn our attention to actually holding our political leaders to account. Polarization for these people is easy. And that's thing 3. Living in a binary yes no world, Republican Democrat world, good evil world is an easy world for our politicians because it's a world that they can exploit. When they know that the voters are thinking in yes no terms, the choices are very simple. All they got to do is avoid all the complexity, nuance, and difficult issues and just make you pick one of those choices. And when we're picking one of those choices, we are more likely to hate anybody that picks the other choice. And most Americans like us don't even fit into cleanly one of those buckets, but we've got to. We're forced to. And so in the vice presidential debate tomorrow night, when you realize that what they're really trying to do is create stark choices in election theory and in political science. They call this contrast, right? When they know that they're trying to drive contrast with the choice that is fundamentally against you, make it good versus evil, that world is really easy for the political leader. Because as I just said on thing 2, the political leader, that's an easy world because they don't have to actually solve the problem. To stay elected, they just got to make you scared. They got to turn you against each other. And then they just have to hope that they drive enough contrast that you show up to vote the next time as well. And again, who gets off scot free in this model? Them, not us. We lose. When we are susceptible to polarization and their tendencies, we are more likely to turn against each other, which means that the status quo remains. So, as we think about the vice presidential debate tomorrow night, as we go into that, remember that the way that our candidates show up in the public square, if you're sitting in that debate and you say, man, this is nonsense. I don't like this at all. This is not interesting. Or you say, they're not holding them to account. They're not saying the truth. Or if you say, why won't these candidates actually have a real productive conversation? It's because they know that that's not what gets rewarded. If you realize that we live in a culture of fear, we live in a moment where the real debate is online social media, 30-second short clips. It's not decided by 90-minute TV conversation. And when we realize that our candidates want to force us to think in yes, no binary choices, we can suddenly start to say, we want something different. If you're sitting there tomorrow and you say, this debate does not represent America, this debate does not represent the best of us, this debate does not represent what real nuanced, honest conversation should be like, well, that's the goal of the hopeful majority. It's to recognize and understand that the majority of Americans out there, Republican, Democrat, extreme views or not, doesn't matter. Almost all of us are aligned in this notion that we have to actually work with each other to solve our problems and that we have to reward a new way of politics. And the candidates, importantly, are not trying to build that new world of politics because this one is easy for them. It's yes, no. It's easy to drive us against each other. We got to demand something different. And so if you're new to the show and you're joining this episode and you're like, you know what? I actually resonate with that vision because I think it's time to unplug from the outrage industrial complex. It's time to say, reclaim our country so that we can actually have honest and open conversations so that real truth can actually be discovered so that we can better understand and see each other, hold space for each other. If you like that vision, every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content, we put out different episodes. Sometimes we'll have interview conversations. We'll bring on fascinating guests like last week, Deb Roy. He used to be chief media scientist at Twitter from 2013 to 2017. Now he's a professor and a director of the Center for Constructive Communication at MIT. Also leading an AI startup. We have many fascinating conversations like that, but then also we have monologues like this because it's time to expose the outrage industrial complex. I'm curious what you think of this episode as you watch the vice presidential debate tonight, because I hope we leave this episode inoculated against the polarizing tendencies of our candidates. I'll see you next week.